This evening, we're going to talk a bit about arguably the most important era in the history of South Carolina, the Reconstruction period. A period of history that has been interpreted and reinterpreted by historians, activists, intellectuals, politicians for generations, and I believe we'll probably reinterpret it for generations more to come. We have a lot to cover tonight. We have a lot of people to talk about this evening. Some you probably heard of before, and some you may not be as familiar with. This evening, we are especially honored to welcome as a special guest this evening, who will also chime in about Reconstruction, Dr. Vernon Burton, Clemson University. He is, as you saw in this week's study guide, a specialist in not only the Reconstruction era, but also thinking about how the Reconstruction era ties to American history in the here and now. One of his most recent works is the edited collection, Lincoln's Unfinished Work, about the legacy of the Reconstruction era. Also, he has written the book, The Age of Lincoln, which was a Pulitzer Prize nominated work. He is also this evening going to talk a bit about another book he's written or co-written about the law and the Constitution. And I want him to talk about that book some this evening, because that book also has a lot to say about not just the Reconstruction era, but the legacy of Reconstruction. So please give our guest, Dr. Burton, a warm round of applause.
Robert, if I may, let me say a few things about Dr. Burton. He knocked on Modjeska's door next door sometime in the early 70s when he was working on a PhD at Princeton. Correct me if I'm wrong, Dr. Burton. And he's doing his PhD on Reconstruction. And though Modjeska wasn't born in Reconstruction, he interviewed her and she asked if he had a place to stay and ended up staying there for days and days. And I certainly reconnected with Vernon, and he's been most considerate and helpful. He's a homeboy, born in South Carolina, and he has an emeritus title at Clemson, and he's retired from the University of Chicago at Champaign, Illinois. And he is one of the nation's experts, leading experts on not only Lincoln, but also Ben Tillman. And so we're pleased to have him. Thank you, Vernon.
Thank you. You know, and I would make a joke this evening about how we have all the flagship institutions represented here, USC, Clemson, and Claflin. But my colleagues at SC State will not be happy about that, so I will refrain from that joke. We'll work on that, but we definitely will. But okay, so we've got a lot to do tonight. The first thing I like to do is I like to actually read a passage from the Sims History of South Carolina. Again, we cited it a few times last week when talking about the Civil War era. And I want to just read a few lines from this book that really detail how Reconstruction was taught in schools in South Carolina in the 1930s. So I'll just read a couple of passages. Describing Reconstruction, the Sims textbook said, for the next 9 years, 1868 to 1877, South Carolina was governed by a set of thieves and plunderers, encouraged and aided by the Republicans in the Congress of the United States. After the first 2 years, every county in the state was in debt except Anderson and Fairhaven. The first legislature was composed of members who owned so little property that their taxes were only $3.12 on an average. At its very first session, the legislature nearly trebled the debt of the state. The selling of votes in legislature was common. There was much bribery and graft. More than half legislators were Negroes, many of whom could neither read nor write. The state's money was stolen by the legislators. Taxes mounted higher and higher until thousands of acres of land had to be sold to meet them. Legislators bought at the expense of the state liquors and cigars, furniture, women's clothes, jewelry, groceries, and so on. While the members of the radical legislatures were stealing and squandering the state's money, the mentally sick people in the lunatic asylum were actually in need of food because the shameless legislatures had not appropriated money to buy it for them. For the same reason, the public schools were closed and convicts who could not be fed or turn out of the penitentiary. To keep the thieving radicals or Republicans in power in South Carolina, the Republican leaders in Congress had more and more United States troops sent to the state to overawe and threaten its citizens. From the start, the rascally Republicans realized that they would be driven out by the people of the state unless they had United States troops at their backs. The Republicans organized and armed companies of Negro soldiers in the state militia, but refused to allow militia companies to be formed by white men. With the arming of the Negroes, crime increased greatly. Houses were burned in the night. White women were often insulted if they appeared alone on the streets. Now I'll read one last paragraph. It talks about a group that's really important to the night's discussion. This dreadful condition of affairs forced the white people of the state to organize secretly for their own protection. They formed small bands called Ku Klux Klans, whose purpose was to frighten the Negroes from their evil doing. The Ku Klux met only at night. They dressed in long white robes and caps. They were always mounted, and the very sight of these ghostly riders galloping by in the night was usually enough to terrify the superstitious Negroes. Many of the best men in South Carolina belonged to the Ku Klux Klan. Again, that's just parts of the Reconstruction narrative that is presented in the Sims History of South Carolina. Again, this version was published in the early 1930s. But I read that because the interpretation of Reconstruction you're going to hear from both myself and Dr. Burton is a little bit different from that one, to say the least. But it's important to understand what folks grew up learning in this state about Reconstruction for really almost a century and a half. And in fact, I think Dr. Burton even has an interesting quote from someone in the 1990s about Reconstruction that I hope that he shares with us this evening. But what we're going to do tonight is talk about a few things in regards to Reconstruction, especially how Reconstruction was arguably the most progressive era in this state's history. Progressive in many different senses, but we also want to discuss how Reconstruction from the beginning was hampered by inaction from the federal government and also by massive resistance here within South Carolina. So to get us started off this evening, I want to first start up with this this painting that we saw last week at the end of class. Again, this shows the march of federal soldiers into Charleston in 1865. And I think it's important for us to start here because what this image shows is the potential that many Black Americans felt in the state of South Carolina when the Civil War came to an end. Now, contrary to what the Sims textbook just mentioned about US troops being in South Carolina, many historians have argued in the last 20, 25 years, arguably even more than that, that really there were never quite enough troops in the state to keep Reconstruction going. If you go down the road to the campus of South Carolina, for example, you will see a marker in front of the library, Thomas C. Cooper Library, that says that it was basically an area of federal occupation. And it sounds as though there were thousands upon thousands of troops in the state. It wasn't quite that robust a presence once the war came to an end. But with the potential for what South Carolina could be, we also have to reflect on what South Carolina was in 1865. So much of the state was in ruins. Charleston and Columbia had been destroyed by the war. The destruction of slavery had also left the economy in an uncertain and precarious state. And so the people of South Carolina had some serious choices to make. And in 1865, it appeared the choice that many white leaders of the state were going to make was to try to keep the Black population in as close a condition to slavery as possible. Now, throughout the South, right after the Civil War, we don't want to just jump from the Civil War to Reconstruction. Certainly, this is a long and arduous process, and as we discussed last week, if you think about things like the Port Royal experiment in 1861, you can make an argument Reconstruction began in South Carolina long before it began anywhere else. At the very least, the template for Reconstruction was being set in the Palmetto State. However, as the Southern states tried to re-enter the Union in the fall and winter of 1865, many of those states reconstituted their state governments and quickly set about passing what were called Black codes, designed to essentially keep Black Americans in a place as close to servitude as possible. And what you see here and on the next slide are examples of what those Black codes look like. Now, remember, the 13th Amendment of the Constitution will be formally ratified in part of the US Constitution by December of 1865. So officially, slavery was dead. However, as you notice with the Black codes here that were also passed in December of 1865, many white Southerners were trying to find ways to keep Black Americans as close to slavery as possible. Of course, a big part of this was white supremacy, but a major part was also trying to keep an economic base that was downtrodden, to try to find a way to continue to exploit this labor system. So, for example, one of the Black codes passed by the government here in South Carolina states here, all persons of color who make contracts for service of labor shall be known as servants, and those with whom they contract shall be known as masters. So right off the bat, you see the language here is one that's trying to keep a master-slave relationship, except now it's a master-servant relationship. Another Black code, this is part of the same series of codes. I'll just read this out and you'll see what they're trying to do here. On farms or in outdoor service, the hours of labor, except on Sunday, shall be from sunrise to sunset, with a reasonable interval for breakfast and dinner. Servants shall rise at the dawn in the morning, feed, water, and care for the animals on the farm, do the usual and needful work about the premises, prepare their meals for the day if required by the master, and begin the farm work or other work by sunrise. The servant, there's that word there, shall be careful of all the animals and property of his master, and especially of the animals and implements used by him, shall protect the same from injury by other persons, and shall be answerable for all property loss, destroyed, or injured by his negligence, dishonesty, or bad faith. One of the key themes of the Modjeska School is this idea of looking at the intersection of race and class. And tonight we're going to do a lot of that and also look at the intersection of race, class, and gender in this history. But what you have to understand is that South Carolinians white South Carolinians that is, had been so used to a labor system that put Black Americans at the very bottom, that the Black codes were designed to continue and indeed perpetuate that system for as long as possible. Now, this is not just happening in South Carolina. All across the South, what you're seeing is that Southern states are passing Black codes. At the same time, Southern states are also sending to Congress representatives and senators from those states as they return to the Union. Now, to make a very, very long story short, during the Civil War, the federal government is having these really serious debates and arguments within Congress, within President Lincoln's cabinet, about how best to readmit the Southern states into the Union. Some Republicans, again, Lincoln was a Republican himself, some Republicans felt it was important to do it as quickly as possible. Let the states come back in, let bygones be bygones, move on. President Lincoln himself, before his assassination, had supported what was known as the 10% plan, where 10% of citizens in those states would basically vow their loyalty to the Union, and they would return to the Union with no questions asked. Other Republicans, that we now call radical Republicans, said that the punishment for the South should be much more severe, and more should also be done to help Black Americans in the Deep South. Now, of course, Lincoln was assassinated in April 1865, and his successor was Andrew Johnson, formerly a senator from Tennessee. He was the only Southern politician to stay in Congress during the Civil War. And in 1864, he became Abraham Lincoln's running mate. In 1865, he found himself president of the United States. Now, when Congress came back into session in 1865, they found themselves confronted with Southerners some of whom had served in the Confederate government. And many Republicans suffice to say, were not happy about having their former adversaries suddenly sitting in Congress as though nothing had happened. Among those who were in Congress were Alexander Stephens of Georgia, who before the Civil War had been a congressman, after the war was a congressman, but during the war was kind of the vice president of the Confederacy. There was a lot of outrage in the North about the readmission of the South so quickly into the Union. And what you see the next few years from 1865 to 1868 is a clash between President Johnson on the one hand and some Democrats versus many members of the Republican Party on the other over how to A, readmit the Southern states, and B, as would be increasingly clear by 1866, what was to be done for the newly freed Black Americans across the South. Now, I'm mentioning the national context of this story because to understand what happens in South Carolina in the same time period, you have to have a sense of what's going on nationally as well. And this really leads to what historians have traditionally referred to as the rise of quote unquote radical Reconstruction, where the Republican Party really takes the reins of Reconstruction from President Johnson. Now, in 1866, you have a number of events that occur that convince Republicans that they are going to have to do a lot more Reconstruction than they had planned on doing. For one, there are several major race riots in the South in the summer of 1866, most notably in the cities of Memphis and New Orleans. The Memphis riot in particular is sparked by, surprisingly enough, police violence against Black Americans. The New Orleans riot is actually sparked partially by Black Americans in that city trying to organize a Republican Party in Louisiana. A couple of themes we'll see come up again in the course of the semester: the pursuit of political power on the one hand and the fear of police brutality on the other. Also in 1866, you have the first Civil Rights Act passed in the United States, which was designed to basically break the back of the Black codes across the South. President Johnson vetoes this Civil Rights Act, and his veto is overridden by a 2/3 majority in the House, showing that there is going to be a showdown between the Republicans in Congress and President Johnson. Finally, in 1866, by the end of that year, the Ku Klux Klan, which according to this book was the home of the best and brightest of South Carolina, was formed in Tennessee. Now, the story of Reconstruction is partly a story of the rise of the Klan. And that's a story we're going to touch on some today, in fact, in a very important manner later on this evening. But all those events in 1866 really contribute to the creation of a more robust Reconstruction policy by the Republican Party and by the federal government. Now, the poster you see here shows how some in the Democratic Party felt about these new policies. In the 1860s, Democrats were increasingly asserting themselves as a white man's party. They had already done so before the Civil War. During the era of Andrew Jackson, they proudly proclaimed what they called themselves as the democracy, as a party for and by white men. But in the 1860s, being a party of white men meant that they also had to portray the Republican Party, as you can see here, the party of the Negro. Now, it's important to note, before we go on, that saying you're the party of white men in the 1860s also meant that you were taking a decisive and total stance against women's rights as well, which we'll come back to in a moment. Okay. Now, in terms of thinking about how the federal government was planning for the end of the war, I see Randall had a question about that. In terms of a Marshall Plan-like idea, you didn't quite see that. What you do see is that amongst Republicans in particular, there is hope that they can radically change the Southern way of life to be less dependent on slavery and the plantation system. And instead, they wanted to pursue a strategy where they would really push more white Southerners into independent yeoman farming and also help build heavy industry throughout the South. But in terms of a Marshall Plan-like program, That did not quite happen. And if you know anything about Southern history since the Civil War, what you probably know is that the South has for over 150 years been in desperate need of some sort of economic stimulus. Just a couple of days ago, there was a report released that you could find easily online that shows rates of health disparities, mortality rates for giving birth to children, et cetera. And what you notice is that the South, even today in 2023, has higher rates of infant mortality, has worsening rates of healthcare. Every economic and social indicator of a healthy and vibrant society is in reverse in the Deep South. In other words, the South has really never dealt fully with some of these problems, many of these problems rather, that indicate living a full, healthy life. And I think, in fact, that's actually one of the reasons why you have a progressive network here in South Carolina, because I think a lot of folks here feel it in their bones that things are not right in the South. And there are historic and other reasons for that, a lot of which we're exploring in this class this semester. Oh, and don't worry, Randall. I will get to 40 acres and a mule in just a moment. Don't you worry one bit. Okay, so what's important to note is that after 1866, and especially after the 1867 Reconstruction Act, where Congress sets up new guidelines for Southern states to be readmitted to the Union, each Southern state has to basically write a new state constitution. So if you ever find yourself, say, on our state's Wikipedia page, and you're wondering, why is there an 1865 Constitution and 1868 Constitution? My first question to you is, why are you on the state's Wikipedia page? But I digress. We all have our reasons. But more importantly, there is a very good reason for that. Because of the Reconstruction Act, the state had to write a new state constitution. And this is where things get a bit tricky in terms of governing the state. When this convention meets, late 1867, early 1868, many of its delegates are Black Americans within South Carolina. Some of them are from the Charleston Colored Society. Some of them are from the upstate and the Midlands. Some of them are even from outside the state. But they all convene and decide to try to write a new and much more progressive constitution, one that they believe embodies the best of the state of South Carolina and can actually put the state away from its earlier traditions of not only slavery, but also a focus on elite society. Now, this convention would eventually craft a constitution that, amongst other things, creates the first public school system in South Carolina, creates a system for the first time in state's history of no-fault divorce, a system of economics that was designed to actually answer the question of 40 acres and a mule. We'll talk about that in a moment. But amongst other things, what the convention does is it basically destroys any vestige of rule by whites only, and instead tries to create a system of government that is open to everyone, and that is fair to everyone. And one of the things I want to do right now is talk a bit about some of the figures who are pivotal in the creation, not only of this new state constitution, but of a new way of life in South Carolina. One of those individuals is William J. Whipper, who was actually not originally from South Carolina, moves to the state during the Civil War era, fighting for the Union Army. He stays here, and he eventually gets heavily involved in the state's politics. He actually works with Civil War hero Robert Smalls and Richard Howell Gleaves to create the Beaufort Republican Club, which was the first Republican club in the state. Whipper was also a delegate to the Constitutional Convention here in South Carolina, and this is where the question of gender comes up. Now let's rewind for just a quick second. If you might recall your American history or civics lessons, you may know that in 1848, the first major women's suffrage convention was held in the United States at Seneca Falls, New York. And that convention is actually crafted primarily by folks who are involved in the abolitionist movement. Now, American women have been pushing for the right to vote since 1848. And by the mid to late 1860s, there is a feeling among some members of the suffrage movement that this might be their best chance yet to push not only for voting rights on a state level, but perhaps even dream of an amendment to the Constitution to guarantee voting rights regardless of gender. Now, at this convention, Whipper is actually the person who presents to the state convention the idea of granting women the right to vote. He's the first person at the state convention to make this argument, and he really pushes headlong into this idea of expanding voting rights, not just for men, regardless of color, but also for women as well. A big reason for this is who Whipper is married to, which we'll talk about in a second. Unfortunately, the amendment does not actually pass. In fact, what ends up happening is that the so-called radical convention, the most radical members of the convention say, women's right to vote might be a bridge too far even for us. But what you see here through William J. Whipper is that the idea of freedom is a greatly expanded idea. And what you also see is that this is a true era that the historian and writer Lerone Bennett Jr. referred to as revolutionary time. For those who don't know, Bennett was editor of Ebony magazine for many years, and he wrote extensively about Black history in that magazine. And he would sometimes write about this idea of revolutionary time, where there is a moment in history where things that seemed impossible or very unlikely one year were suddenly close to becoming mainstream thought and perhaps even becoming fully integrated into the actual system of power and of rule of law. The problem with revolutionary time, Bennett pointed out, is that you usually don't know when it actually comes. And sometimes activists push too quickly and they miss their window. Other times they may wait too late and it never comes again. The point here, though, is that Whipper felt there was a good opportunity to expand voting rights at a time when the idea of expanding suffrage for women was one that was just starting to be debated about throughout the country.
Dr. Greene?
Yes.
My phone just rang. It was William S. Whipper from Charleston.
Are you
saying he
serious?
can't get on. This is a direct descendant of William J. Whipper, who may be joining us in a minute.
So that is, I can't think of a better example of speak of the devil and he shall appear. This is not the devil. This is one of Whipper family members. That's actually really hilarious. You never know what you're going to get in the Modjeska school. I can tell you that much right now. But I mentioned a moment ago that Whipper was a stalwart champion of women's rights. And part of that was because of the fact that he married into the Rollins family. Now, I think some of you who are from South Carolina may be aware of the Rollins sisters, Frances, Charlotta, and Catherine Rollins, who came from a member of the Charleston elite, the colored elite of Charleston, rather, and they really come of age and become very prominent during the Reconstruction era. This is a photograph of Frances Rollins, who was actually married to William Whipper. And the Rollins sisters, they start out as members of Charleston High Society. Several of them moved to Columbia and become part, basically, of the larger state government during the Reconstruction period. They host various events and get-togethers where Republican leaders, Black and white, can meet and talk about major issues of the day. And Frances Rollins, as you can see here, is one of the founders of the South Carolina Women Suffrage Association during the Reconstruction period. Again, one of the reasons I want to highlight Whipper and the Rollins sisters is that when we talk about Reconstruction, it becomes very easy to not recognize that there is so much revolutionary fervor in the air. I mean, granting, of course, thinking about the fact that Black men gained the right to vote is in itself a revolutionary moment in history. But the fact that women, Black and white, are also pushing for the right to vote as well during this time period really showcases how many felt that Reconstruction was an era of unbridled promise. But of course, as we already know, it was also an era of unreached potential in many ways. Speaking of unreached potential, being someone who works for a living in Orangeburg, I do want to briefly talk about Benjamin F. Randolph, who was arguably on the way to becoming one of the state's most important politicians until he was assassinated in 1868. And now Randolph was a representative from Orangeburg at the convention, and he was later elected to the state senate in late 1887. Randolph is actually a good example of many of the Black leaders who were killed during Reconstruction, because Randolph himself was traveling in South Carolina campaigning for other Republican leaders when he was killed in early 1868. He's actually buried here in the Randolph Cemetery.
Right down Elmwood.
It's named after him. But I point out Randolph because being from Orangeburg, you always have a sense of how we tend to only talk about Orangeburg with the Orangeburg Massacre of 1968. But what you see 100 years before that is that Orangeburg was already beginning to produce important leaders for the state who were then killed before they could really have a chance to do anything. Randolph's assassination, though, is also indicative of a larger problem faced by Black leaders and their white Republican allies during the Reconstruction era, the ever-present threat of violence. Now, we often associate this violence with the Ku Klux Klan, but I do want to mention that about 30 years later, when they're having the debate over the 1895 Constitution, Robert Smalls, the Civil War hero and politician after the war, points out that he estimated that up to over 53,000 Black Americans were killed during Reconstruction. That's just an estimate. We aren't exactly sure. Many recent works on Reconstruction have talked more and more about the kind of violence faced by Black Americans all across the South. I do want to read a very brief passage from a new book about this violence. It's called, I put it in the chat, it's called I Saw Death Coming. It's by a historian named Kadada Williams. It is an excellent book about Reconstruction. And I'll read just one brief passage from it. And this is about the state of Alabama in 1865. And again, this is not meant to be sensationalistic, but this is just the violence that folks saw during Reconstruction. 1 July 1865 report of Alabama, quote unquote, murders and barbarities, end quote, included multiple hangings, incidents of Black people being chained to trees and set on fire, and countless disappearances as incidents of white reprisal spread. Quote, murder with his ghastly train stalks and rebels and undisputed carnage, the reporting agent wrote. The bodies of lynching victims were often left hanging. In one case, a man at Magnolia Bluff was ordered out of his home, and a gang's 5 attack dogs were set upon him, leaving him nearly dead at the time of the reports. A preacher at Bladen Springs reported Choctaw County's main roads stank with the decomposing bodies of people likely trying to escape continuing enslavement. Murderous attacks on Black people who were leaving or had left bondage were not random. They were calculated to punish those who dared to be free. Now, again, I don't read that section to sensationalize the violence of the Reconstruction era. Instead, I read that section to give you a sense of what folks like Randolph, Rollins sisters, many others were up against during the Reconstruction period. Now, one thing about the Reconstruction era in South Carolina is that you were also seeing, despite all the violence, despite the, at times, lack of federal support, you are seeing attempts by Blacks in South Carolina to expand educational opportunities for their citizens in the state. By 1870, you see the creation of 3 colleges in South Carolina, built primarily, but not only for Black Americans. Claflin, of course, in 1869, Alley University, which was founded in 1870 in Cokesbury, but then Boosa Columbia by 1880, and Benedict College. Now, a couple of things make these institutions of higher learning interesting. They all had links to a different church. Claflin to the Methodist Church, Allen to the African Methodist Episcopal Church, and Benedict to the Baptist Church. What you see here in the state of South Carolina is that a lot of the private universities founded by and for Black Americans were being done in conjunction with various religious institutions and religious movements. Now, this building you see here on the PowerPoint, by the way, this is actually a building at Claflin University circa 1900. I often show this building to my students, not just because it's the campus of Claflin and it shows their predecessors at the university, but because of what this photograph was used for. Now, I'll cover this again next week in a bit more detail, but in 1900, W.E.B. Du Bois creates an exhibition in Paris, which is part of the Paris World's Fair-like exposition event. He is charged with creating the American Negro exhibit, and he has photographs taken of various Black institutions, including Claflin. And this is one of the photographs he used. I do this because I think it's easy for students here in South Carolina to forget that despite all the bad things that have happened here, this state does also have a rich intellectual and cultural legacy and heritage, if we are willing to actually talk about it and discuss it in great detail. But the attempt to expand opportunities of education for Black and white citizens in the state is not just limited to the creation of these new schools in Orangeburg and Columbia. By 1873, in fact, the University of South Carolina becomes the first, and as we know, the only public university in the Deep South to be desegregated during the Reconstruction period. This happens partly as a result of the state government realizing that its new constitution basically would allow anybody to attend USC if they so wish to do so. In 1873, you begin to see the introduction of both Black students and Black faculty at the University of South Carolina. Among the faculty include this gentleman here, Richard T. Greener, who worked in various jobs at the university, including as the head librarian and part of the law school there. He had a variety of different hats he wore, helping to lead USC in a new era. Now, unfortunately, this is the part of the presentation where I do a shameless plug for a certain book that I helped to co-edit, and I co-edited it, called Invisible No More, The African American Experience at the University of South Carolina. I'll put a link to it in the chat later this evening. Now, this book was co-edited by myself and Tyler D. Perry, and one of the reasons we wanted to have this book written was that we were aware that most folks who even attend USC are not aware there were Black students and faculty there during the Reconstruction period. In fact, I was unaware of that until I was a student there in 2012, and I heard from others that, yeah, there were Black students here in the 1870s, and initially I didn't believe it because it's such a shocking story, but it's really an important part of the university's history. So important, in fact, that if you go to the university campus now, you don't really see a whole lot mentioned about that era of the university's history. Again, if you look at plaques about USC's history during the Reconstruction period, they're often intentionally vague about what the university was like during that 4-year time period. I'll talk more about that in a second. Now, it is also important to note that if you're curious, let me go back a few slides. If you're curious about the Rollins sisters, there is a great ETV documentary about the Rollins sisters that I would highly recommend you check out if you have a chance. I believe it's actually on their website if you want to watch at least snippets of it. And from time to time, ETV does replay the Rowland Sisters documentary, but it goes into great detail about what the Rowland Sisters did before, during, and after the Reconstruction period. Hey, now, I know that Randall mentioned in the chat something about 40 acres and a mule, which is a really important part of the Reconstruction story. For those who are not aware, 40 acres and a mule was actually, it's not just a slogan amongst Black Americans, it's based off of a special field order issued by General William T. Sherman in 1865 that was designed to help Black Americans living on the Sea Islands, near Savannah and the coast of Georgia, South Carolina, and Florida to help them get on their feet after the Civil War was over. The idea was very simple. They would take land from former plantation owners who fought for the Confederacy during the Civil War and reapportion that land to the folks who once lived and worked on that land. Now, the thing about 40 acres and a mule, again, 40 acres per family, and also a government mule as well. The thing about 40 acres and a mule is that it was briefly tried in 1865. But by the end of that year, most of that land was reconfiscated by the federal government and given back to the plantation owners who held it before and during the Civil War, creating, I think, an understandable and lasting enmity between many Black Americans living on the coast and the federal government. It was Freedmen's Bureau operatives, in fact, who were told to tell Black Americans in the Sea Islands, this land we gave to you no longer belongs to you. And even the Freedmen's Bureau agents initially refused to carry out those orders, and so basically threatened to do so by President Johnson. Now, what does that have to do with South Carolina? Well, when the state writes a new state constitution, something that numerous Black delegates of the convention argue for is some system of land apportionment to give land to poor Blacks and whites in the state of South Carolina. They understood better than anyone else the importance of land ownership as a form of economic and political power. And so initially they sent delegates to Washington, D.C. to ask Congress for funds to purchase land to give to people in the state. Congress refuses. So they decide, fine, we'll do it ourselves. And in 1869, one of the first acts under the new Constitution is the creation of the South Carolina Land Commission, which, as its charter, was essentially to basically purchase land from former slaveholders who, in the late 1860s, were desperately trying to sell land off because they could no longer get anybody to work it for them. And the government would then lease the land to anyone willing to purchase a lease. Now, how this worked was that if you purchased a piece of land through the Land Commission, you had a set number of years during which you could work off the lease. At the end of that time period, if you finished working off and paying off the lease, you owned the land in perpetuity. It was yours to do with what you will. Now, initially, many white South Carolinians boycott the program. Now, keep in mind, the Land Commission was open to everyone in the state. This was not, and this is important though too, because I think people with Reconstruction kind of think of it as, oh, there is a Black government in charge of the state, doing things for Black people. No. The government of South Carolina in the 1860s and 70s was so radical and so progressive precisely because for the first time in the state's history, it tried to treat everyone fairly. The Land Commission was an example of that. It was open to anyone willing to purchase land and lease the land for several years and work off that lease. The first 2 years of the Land Commission was mostly utilized by Black Americans because white Americans in the state were largely boycotting the state government because they saw it as illegitimate. They did not believe that the Republican Party had the authority to govern in South Carolina. So they just boycotted elections. They boycotted any sort of interaction with the government beyond what they absolutely had to do. And the Land Commission was an example of that. So instead, you see a large increase in Black land ownership in the state almost overnight. By 1872, Francis Cardozo, the man you see here on the screen, who at one point served as the state's Secretary of State, the first Black man to hold that position in the state's history, also eventually oversees the Land Commission program as well, further ensuring that Black Americans have access to cheap land for years to come. By the 1880s, under a different government, white Americans would also participate in the Land Commission. And based on reports and studies we've done, we're pretty sure that by the time the commissions ended in 1890, more land is owned by white South Carolinians than Black South Carolinians through the Land Commission program. Now, unfortunately, one of the issues that landowners run into is that because they're purchasing land, because they are participating in this economy, they are not divorced from the national and global economy. So while many Black Americans buy into the program, after the Panic of 1873, in which the global economy suffers a catastrophic loss, many Black Americans find it difficult, if not impossible, to pay off their leases through the Land Commission. So many of them unfortunately lose the farms that they have and grown. But those who are able to weather that temporary economic storm sometimes own the land to this very day. For example, the Harriet Barber House in Lower Richland is an example of a piece of land purchased under the Land Commission, which has belonged to the same family for over a century and a half now. By the way, important note, no other state tried a Land Commission program like South Carolina's. So one of the great historical ironies is that talking about 40 acres and a mule, that actually briefly happened here in South Carolina, albeit not with the mule, just actually. Now, despite all these attempts at progressive reform throughout the state of South Carolina, as I mentioned before, you do have the ever-present threat of violence. And this is going to come up time and time again, not just in this time period, but in time periods afterwards too. By the late 1860s, there is a new president of the United States, Ulysses S. Grant, former commanding general of the Federal Army, who was not a Republican president starting in 1869. At that same time, however, Klan activity has increased throughout the South, especially in South Carolina. And as you can see from cartoons like this one, the Klan, which in many parts of the South is a paramilitary arm of the Democratic Party, is targeting not only Black Americans, but also white allies of the Republican Party throughout the South as well. It becomes very easy to think of the Reconstruction era as an era of a white Ku Klux Klan versus a Black Republican Party. But in many parts of the South, it wasn't quite as simple as that. We do have former Confederate leaders, for example, who actually join the Republican Party and decide that, you know what, the South needs to be changed for the better. We can do this best through the Republican Party. Now, they were a decided minority, but there is a reason, for example, why it's very difficult to find statues of, say, James Longstreet, who actually does just that after the Civil War, joining the Republican Party. Klan activity becomes so severe in the South that by 1870, President Grant signs a series of Ku Klux Klan acts, which are designed to target, disrupt, and ultimately destroy the backbone of the Klan as an organization throughout the South. The Klan itself is becoming a severe impediment to Reconstruction throughout the region. Now, one problem that President Grant and Republicans face on a national level is that many white Northerners, I'm not talking about the South, I'm talking about white Northerners now, actually refuse to believe the situation was that dire in the South. For example, the report I just read to you from Alabama in 1865, some folks in the North did not believe it. They felt that the stories of atrocities against Black Americans were exaggerated, or others felt that, well, white Southerners just fighting back in self-defense, they lost the Civil War, just leave them alone. You might even say some of them thought that it was little more than, use a current expression, fake news. But this is the problem the federal government was faced with, is that many white Americans, North and South, were not especially interested in Black civil rights. Even some Republicans really saw Black civil and voting rights as a means to an end. For some Republican leaders, they felt that Black Americans in the South should be granted voting rights because they would be a natural voting base for the Republican Party. But there were still other Republicans like Thaddeus Stevens of Pennsylvania, for example, or Charles Sumner of Massachusetts, who felt that the Civil War could not fully be won and its ideals not fully cherished and defended unless Black Americans were granted these civil and political rights. And certainly with the Ku Klux Klan Act, what you see is that President Grant is trying to use force to help ensure the success of Reconstruction. So what does that look like on the ground? Well, one of the things that the Ku Klux Klan Act does is it empowers the Attorney General, a man named Amos Ackerman, to use federal marshals and federal troops to enforce the new Klan laws. And the place where Klan activity is actually at its worst is in the upstate of South Carolina, where in 1871, habeas corpus is suspended in 9 counties in South Carolina, and federal troops and marshals were brought in to restore order. Now, during this same time period in 1870 and 71, Black Americans are journeying to Washington, D.C. and to various state capitals in the South, giving testimony about what they are experiencing at the hands of the Klan. In fact, the book I just cited, I Saw Death Coming, a lot of it is pulled from those testimonials where Black Americans, men, women, and children are talking about being attacked in the middle of the night by the Klan, being driven from their homes by the Klan, facing the very real possibility of death every single day of their lives, simply because they decided to assert their rights as citizens. Now, Ackerman's story is also rather interesting. I didn't mention this before, but Ackerman fought for the Confederacy in the Civil War. He was actually from Georgia. After the war was over, he became friends with Ulysses Grant and decided that it was probably better for the future of the South to enforce civil rights laws. So Ackerman himself personally leads federal authorities into South Carolina to enforce the Ku Klux Klan laws. Now, thousands of white South Carolinians are accused of either direct or indirect work with the KKK. Many of them flee the state. Some never return to South Carolina. Others do years and decades later. But despite the fact that most folks in the state are not willing to testify against the Klan, the message sent is quite clear that support for the Klan quickly plummets in South Carolina, and the Klan as a political force is basically spent in the state after 1871. And what you're seeing throughout the South is thanks to the various Klan acts and this vigorous federal action, the Klan starts to weaken as a serious institution. That's the good news. The bad news is part of the reason for the Klan's fading from history, at least in this era, is that as you're going to see this week and next week, what ends up happening is that white Southerners find that by 1873-74, they don't have to wear any hoods and sheets anymore. They can do what they wish in broad daylight without the threat of retaliation. We'll talk about why that's the case in a moment. Right.
Look and see if Seth, looks like Seth is joined us, the Jackson Whipper. So J.S. Whipper. And tell him that he's only got a few minutes to introduce himself. There he is. Speak to the man. The most 3 famous words during the pandemic is unmute yourself, Mr. Whipper.
Hello, hello.
There you go.
I didn't know you left me that discretion. Thank you.
I'm so sorry. Seth Whipper is a dear friend and a brother, a former representative, a lawyer, we want to hold that against him, and a former judge who is now retired and is at our disposal. And Seth, we just want to give you a few minutes because we've done moved past Mr. Whipper. But I didn't know Robert Greene, Dr. Greene is the teacher, you met him, but I didn't know that your relative there married Ms. Rollins. And so that's something that there's a new video that SCETV has online now about the Rollins family and Seth Whipper's agitation for women's right to vote. So Seth, tell us a few things about growing up as a Whipper.
Well, the picture that you're looking at, this is, can you hear me?
We see you and the picture. It's not the picture.
Can you hear me though?
We hear you loud and clear.
All right. It's so nice to be heard and so nice to have a captive audience. I'm not gonna abuse you though. Okay, but this is a picture of William Whipper. That's him. That picture hangs in the office of the Attorney General, by the way.
Oh, Lord.
And so he looks a lot like my oldest brother's oldest son. They almost look like identical twins. So William Whipper, educated, up north, born up north. He got his legal education in Michigan, some say Detroit. He, along with, I think, Robert Brown, who started the first practice by Blacks in Boston, started the first Deep South practice here in Charleston. And I was by there today at 91 Broad Street. Their names are listed on the title to that property. He, Robert Brown, and another person whose name gets away from me right now. But William Whipper, as a lot of the veterans were, because he's out of Pennsylvania, 31st Colored Troops, he could see that, there was a future. Being, being an immigrant from up north, he could see that there was a future in the South. And he and a couple of his brothers decided to come back here. The most notable brother was, I think, an elder brother by the name of Samuel Parker Whipper, who is indeed my great-grandfather. I think Samuel was his older brother. And so Whipper got involved in civic life. They started the business. He decided to run for office. And as a part of that, you see that people are really gelling. I mean, it's what, I'm going to use the word immigrants. It's what people who have taken notice of what the promise of, the Constitution was, the promise of the initial revolution was, and they see their opportunity, so they want to get involved like that. And that's what he did. And as a part of that, I guess there's a group of folks moving around doing things. And he ran into one of these very vivacious and very well-educated and very spirited young woman. Her name was Frances Rollins. And there were sisters, there were like 5 or 6 of those sisters. They were all educated all over the place, and they were well-spoken. And they also were wanting to be involved in government. And so they, in fact, had a home in Columbia. It was a salon, and it wasn't there for pedicures, but as a salon, as a way, and a way for place that people come and share ideas about government and get organized to get people elected who would be influential in making the promise of the Constitution come true. And so the Rollins sisters, and we have yet to locate the exact house, Brett, but we'll do that soon. And so he married Frances Rollins, and they had 2 children, Iona and Lee. And I'm happy to say that I've had dinner with Lee and talked with him and knew him as cousin Lee, who would come down over the summers and visit people here and visit the hometown, which was Hampton County in South Carolina, the town of Yamasee and Early Branch, and a couple of other small towns down there. And so that's very interesting to me, because what happened was I was doing a paper, a junior paper, and on Reconstruction. I'd already decided I wanted to be a lawyer. And I ran into this guy reading some articles on the Reconstruction government in South Carolina, which was, as Dr. Greene just said, was very progressive. William Whipper was an advocate for the vote for women. He was an advocate for the vote for every human being or every citizen of South Carolina, 1 man, 1 vote. And he was a part of that Reconstruction government that set up public education. I think they even had something to do with the mental hospital, a state hospital for mental health, and a highway system, and a lot of those kinds of agencies and approaches to civic life that were necessary environment. Of course, full rights for everybody, any factor of civic life. And he was a very competent lawyer. Now there's some sort of little haze about what, I mean, you might read something in Wikipedia, you might read something on ancestry.com that gives you some different things, but we feel like what we know is that he, at the end of Reconstruction, he and Francis saw the activity of the Klan becoming a little bit overwhelming. And so Francis, wanting to make sure the children were harmed, convinced him that they should move to Washington, D.C. And they did that for a while. And she started a school for unwed mothers who were minors. And so William, you know, he strived to make a living there for a while, but he was really upset with Ben Tillman, who would not sign his commission as a probate court judge in Beaufort County. And he—
Seth, let's leave it at Seth. I'm going to
Yes.
interrupt you because you're stepping on the next lesson, and we've got
okay.
Dr. Burton in the wing. But I wanted to give people on Zoom or in the class here an opportunity to ask you a question, because we do need to move on because we've got Dr.
All right.
Burton.
Yeah, fine.
Hey, Seth, it's all
Hey.
right. This is Vernon.
Hey,
How
man.
are you?
Man, good to see you, V.
Yeah,
I'm
we
doing
did
good.
the Charleston court case together. I could tell
That's
the
right.
story about Armand.
That's right. We did
Armand
that
and the
county—
Claire, remember?
I remember the county council case. Yeah,
Yeah.
We'll
man.
have it later.
And I want you to know, I want you all to know that case led to the reorganization of our school district as well, because that's an at-large voting system. And they actually reorganized the school districts to be elected almost exactly like the county council seats. So very much, Armin, and thank you very much, Vernon.
Yeah, it was fun. It was fun.
It was. So I answer any questions that anybody may have.
Any questions?
If you're gonna come back, let me know when. I'd like to hear you again. We can catch up.
Oh yeah, let's definitely do that. We'll stay in touch, V. Always good to see you, man.
You too.
JSW Whipper Law, Charleston, South Carolina. That's your commercial advertisement, Seth.
Thank you so much. Let me say this too. Yeah, I got elected after William J, of course. He's a little older than I am, but the thing is, I got elected not long after my mother was elected. And so my mother and I served in the General Assembly together. So for the last 5 years, the General Assembly has been without a whipper. I don't know if to change that, but we might do something about it soon.
All right, I see Randall has his hand raised. Go ahead and ask your question, please.
Mr. Whipper,
Seth, of course.
certainly whatever you want to be addressed as. I am struck by the fact that the first thing you did was show a photo of your predecessor generations and say that others in your family in present day look much like them. And I'm reminded of Robert Smalls when I was teaching in Columbia at Ridgeview High School. There was a descendant named Smalls who was doing a vocational barber class. And when I met him, I didn't know about Robert Smalls. And then I was reading some history about the Civil War. And there's that younger picture of Robert Smalls, which was widely distributed. And he is the spitting image of my barber friend. So all I'll say is that genetics runs deep.
It does matter.
Pull out a picture and say, that reminds me of fill in the blank.
Yeah,
Thank you
yeah,
very
yeah.
much.
Yeah, as a matter, and that's what got me going. When I first saw William, I said, "Hey, that guy looks like somebody in the family." And so I called because I was going to school away from home, and I called home and told them, "Hey, you need this guy out. I think this guy's from." We're started. Thank you all very much for this opportunity, and of course, the whole idea of what I know that Progressive Network is doing is for us to be one people. Because the soul of people and the soul of the right spirits are the ones that we want to support, encourage, and preserve.
Well, thank you, Brother Whipper. Stay tuned to listen to Vernon and Dr. Greene.
Oh, yeah, no doubt. Thank you, Dr. Greene. Thank you all. Good to see you.
Thank you for joining us. And again, this is a reminder that you never know what's going to happen in Modjeska School. So well, with that being said, I do want to kind of turn the floor over to Dr. Burton for a bit. And I think this is a good place for us to kind of pause and reflect on the Reconstruction era. And I know that Dr. Burton, a lot of your work is not just about Reconstruction, but also about the legacy of the Reconstruction era. So I guess I'll ask a two-part question. Number one, if there's anything else about the era in the state you want to talk about, you're more than welcome to do so. But secondly, what I want to ask you directly is, you often refer to the era as in various places, the age of Lincoln or Lincoln's unfinished work. Could you talk a bit more about why you see this as his unfinished work, so to speak?
Yeah, and I can come back to that. I look at it a lot of ways. You know, Lincoln, two, I guess, greatest speeches, at least most famous, his Gettysburg Address, and the second inaugural, which, if we had time, I could spend more than the whole class just on that. One of the most radical documents ever, and maybe speak a little bit to them. But he talks about the unfinished work. Now, people interpret that various different ways. I did a conference here at Clemson on it with about 40 international scholars. For me, it was about race and race relations and citizenship. Different people look at it in different ways, you know, of what he was talking about. But in the context historically, I'm pretty sure that's what he's talking about. And the way I look at it is that, and Lincoln didn't say it was his unfinished, our unfinished work. And he's speaking to the future. He's speaking to the nation of what has to be done. And you can put together, and I made the argument, people can read if they want to, of what I see it is, in particular, and why it is our work that has to be done there. And we can come back. Let me just back up a little bit some of the things. I really enjoyed what you did, Robert. I thought it was great. I do want to center one thing, and I think it is critical, and that is the vote. Seth was here and talked. We worked together on that Charleston case. Today, right now, part of Lincoln's unfinished work is the vote as we are. Seth, I never thought back when we were doing that case that we would see a day when, in fact, people are once again trying to stop people from voting. I really didn't. We saw people trying to dilute the vote, which is what was happening in Charleston, find ways to keep particularly minorities, in this case, Black people, from being able to elect candidates of their choice by using at-large elections and things. And in this Georgia case, one of the 4 Georgia cases I did for Stacey Abrams just recently, one of the attorneys asked me, would I look at what blanking on my favorite justice here, unfortunately. Goodness, he was in the Army. Pardon?
Thurgood, was it Thurgood?
No, this is right now, and I'm being facetious. It's Alito, Judge Alito in the Bronovich case said something, and I'll go back and give you a little context of this to show you we in history like sort of to see patterns. But he said when they ruled, he's going after Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, is what Bronovich is. And that's now being decided really in the Alabama case. It's very frightening because they got rid of Section 5, basically. But what he said was things are not as they were in 1982. For those of you, we're jumping from Reconstruction into a period I would call a little bit after the second Reconstruction. This was a renewal of the Voting Rights Act, which Armin Dürfner was so important in, my co-author and Justice Deferred. And I went back and the lawyers were absolutely flabbergasted and said, no, you're right. Alito, you're wrong. Alito is right. This is not like 1982. It's a lot worse. It's like 1898, 1895, Williams versus Mississippi. It is deliberate attempts to target and keep people from voting using the same methods. I mean, they're also doing the dilution and other things, but that no one was denying people had a right to vote. They were trying to keep them from electing their candidates of choice. But now we're back into this. Just one big thing, and I'll get to your question. In the Dred Scott decision at the lower level, a judge said when he reversed, if they had followed precedent, and we know how the Supreme Court doesn't have to do precedent after we just had the overturning of Roe and precedent after everyone had said they would follow precedent. So they don't have to, but if they had followed precedent, Dred Scott and his wife, who was also a plaintiff, would have been freed, as were their children. Even in South Carolina and Mississippi, you would be freed if you had been as Dred Scott had. And here's what the judge said. Things are not as they were. And of course, he's referring to their word about the North-South conflict coming to the Civil War. So what does Justice Alito says? Things are not like they were in 1982. And then with the overturning, or rather the sort of gutting of the Voting Rights Act of Section 5 and getting rid of Section 4, what does Justice Roberts says? He echoes exact words in Shelby County. He says that things are as they were. So that's always seems to be the excuse. But I want to go back to the centrality of voting. And right now, I think that is what is Lincoln's unfinished work, which I never thought that would be where we would be again. I thought that we had sort of solved those problems with the Voting Rights Act. But to back up a few contingent moments with what you said, and this does not contradict it at all. When Lincoln was assassinated, Johnson becomes president. Lincoln's cabinet was equally divided on whether or not for a former Confederate state to come back into the Union, they would first, they all agreed, would have to ratify, accept the 13th Amendment, which some were pretty reluctant to do. I mean, Ohio just did it recently, fairly recently, but the 13th Amendment to be ratified. But they were equally on whether Black men would be given the vote. For instance, Sumner was very excited about it. But when Johnson became president, he set the precedent when he let in native state, and he wrote into it a grandfather clause. Everyone knows the grant. He said the people who could vote when North Carolina came would be those who were able to vote in 1864 or 1860, meaning only white people, basically. And after that, then it wasn't done. So the reason that in 65 you had the Constitution that comes about, you do another one in 1868, is also because the South Carolina to really get back in had to accept the 14th Amendment, which you really shouldn't have had to have, because the 13th Amendment was interpreted to end the bondage of slavery, and people had hoped. I mean, we read history back, we know it didn't happen, but if you look at that time, African Americans were demanding the right to vote. There were conventions all at that time, and there was real hope. It didn't happen. So with the military governments in 67, then Black men are given the vote, so that's where Robert Smalls and these other people are elected to the Constitution Convention that writes a 68 Constitution. And that's a military order that allows that to happen. And that's when you get this incredibly progressive Constitution. And believe it or not, I don't think Tillman realized that some of that 1868 Constitution and some of the best are still part of our Constitution, even after the 1895, and they're still there, and they can still be used. But one of the things I think Armin and I will talk about is the 13th Amendment. What's happened to the 14th Amendment is a crying shame. There is no doubt what it was written for. Even in Slaughterhouse, that horrible case, except that it was all about white butchers who were Confederates, so it's not so horrible. But they say very clearly there that the 13th and 14th and 15th Amendments were all written for Black people who had been enslaved to ensure those rights. In fact, they said explicitly, they said only the 15th uses the term Negro, but all three of those amendments were for Black people. And yet 80% of all cases of the 14th Amendment now are for corporations. And now the 15th Amendment we just talked about is really under attack because the Voting Rights Act is to assure that. And now affirmative action is being used, literally the 14th Amendment, to try to stop affirmative action, which we'll hear about. This is an incredible time and why I think the vote is so critically important. And one of the things Robert said about the violence, it started even before that. Bushwhackers, former Confederates were riding before there was a Klan in South Carolina. I like to tell people and remind them, I think last time I did, you know, terrorism, people like to think it started in 2011, 2001, September 11th, but African Americans have lived in a terroristic society at least till 1965, the Voting Rights Act in states like South Carolina. And that's the exact legacy you see in Georgia now, where they still have a challenge law, which I showed and will be going to court to testify pretty soon, that it was written, and they say we're writing this so we can challenge any African Americans who try to vote and register to vote. That was the very reason it was. So you have, with this idea of terrorism, it goes back to enslavement, that whites have the right to control Black people, Black bodies, that slave patrols could, the Ku Klux Klan could. So when Ahmaud Arbery is jogging, 3 white men think they have the right to stop him and ultimately kill him. And nothing was done at all. The state, that is the local little district attorney, it was all sort of the old boy network. They literally were doing nothing until that video was sent and a good investigative reporter. And all of that is part of our culture and our history that comes together. So I like what Robert is doing to tie the violence in. That violence is a part of our culture and is still used, and it relates to voting. The one thing I want to say is forever, what did African Americans want? They wanted to be citizens. And part of that citizenship was votes. You can see that from the beginning. You can see that during Jim Crow era, that African Americans want citizenship to be treated equally under the law and that they have the right to vote. One of my many quotes on that, I remember Benjamin Mays saying, I don't care about the anti-lynching law. The Southern Congress let us pay. Give us a vote, we'll take care of that. I wanted to point out too, when you mentioned the great Lerone Bennett, who I had a lot of debates with, Robert, particularly on Lincoln. We had a lot of fun and many a fun dinner arguing about Lincoln. We weren't as far apart as a lot of people thought we were actually. But he is a product of a South Carolinian teacher, that is Ben Mays, who he said was the greatest school teacher of all time. So we have that link even to Lerone Bennett. If he does come out of Georgia, he was taught by Mays and adored Mays on that. Let me see a few other things I haven't on. I'll try to get back and answer your questions on this. Oh, I know what I want to say. The first Freedmen's Bureau Act, which Johnson vetoed, actually had our 40 acres and a mule there. To tie it back to voting, Lincoln did not overturn. That's Johnson. You think a vote doesn't matter about Supreme Court justice or even things like that. And the reason that people on St. Helena and Penn Center and Hilton Head, why African Americans got their land, there were judges, land commission, all appointed by Lincoln, who made those decisions. Even Robert Small's house, they tried to, went all the way to the Supreme Court about whites trying to take it over. And it became a Supreme Court case. Voting matters more than anything. If there's any lesson that I have learned as a historian doing research on race relations, on the South, it is the importance of a fair vote. And that then gets tied in that equal rights under the law that has to be there. Now, you had some questions you wanted to ask me. There's a lot of other stuff I was going to go at with this, but I think that's the main thing. And of course, I love the story of Robert Smalls, you already probably talked about, but it is Robert Smalls who hires somebody to teach him to read and write, who is the person that introduces for South Carolina public education, which, as best I can understand, is not the first state that had education, but public education is here in South Carolina with that resolution that Smalls introduced at 67 and then the 68 Constitutional Convention. But that was part of having to make the 14th Amendment. And then the 15th Amendment should not have been necessary, but at every step, white have tried to, at least a large group of whites have tried to stop Black people from having the right to vote, or at least an equal opportunity to elect candidates of their choice at that time. But why, a big question for a young scholar, why that second Freedmen Bureau bill, where they overrode the veto of Johnson, where Congress did not have the same making it available to African Americans. And one of the reasons probably is there's a Southern Homestead Act, which they thought was going to take care of this issue. It's complicated, but for the first year, as I remember, only people who had been enslaved were eligible for it, and then it opened up to white people throughout. So there was some efforts, obviously. When people say that nothing was done, actually they were thinking in these terms. The problem is, as Seth can tell you, in Congress, you had Democrats opposing it at every issue. The Freedmen Bureau Bank, very important. And that started in 1863 by a Massachusetts abolitionist congressman. But if you look at those debates, I just debated the Federalist Society up in Raleigh. That was a lot of fun on affirmative action being the only. The worst thing is this: white redneck from 96 South Carolina, and who am I debating? A Black conservative head conservative foundation, work for the Federalist Society, who's against affirmative action, and me arguing for it. I mean, the world has turned upside down. Couldn't help but see the, thing, but it's so clear that they're wrong on the 14th Amendment.
Yes.
They really are. I mean, the Freedmen Bureau Bank, all of those were deliberate actions by the same Congress and things, and it was interpreted that way. Now, you had some questions. There's a lot of, I can go on. I don't want to keep doing that because we'll bore the heck out of people.
I think on the contrary, I think folks are quite riveted, but I want to actually get to the audience. I know that Taiba, you had a question in the back. Go ahead, please.
Yeah, I was trying to relate what Dr. Greene, you said, where back in the 1860s or 70s, people either weren't aware, or they thought it was fake news of what was happening at the time, like the lynchings and what was happening to African Americans at the time. And how to relate that to what you were saying just now. This is still happening all over the world, in different parts of the world, here in South Carolina with the voting. Do you feel like it's still an issue where people either don't know what is happening, and in which case, is it a matter of like media and education? Like, what's the way to get people to, or do people just not care and think it's not that important?
When I taught the university, oh, sorry, did you finish? I didn't mean to speak over.
Yes, sir, sorry.
No, sorry, I got in at 2 this morning. I flew in from California, so I didn't have to drive the 96 back here. So I'm still wound up on coffee. So, but I used to ask a question on exams. Students coming, what happened with the first Reconstruction? Why was it not supported as opposed to the second Reconstruction, which is a term we use for the civil rights movement, become common now. And the answer pretty much was television. People just didn't believe it. They didn't believe it. They didn't believe that those 3 civil rights workers been killed, or hundreds and hundreds of others. They just didn't believe these horrible things. First of all, we white Southerners are charming. They love us to come visit and have tea and dinner with them and talk funny. We wouldn't be these kind of violent criminal terrorists. But the idea was that I think something very different is happening now. I used to think there's some of that, but it's hard to believe. I think when you have alternative facts and a president of the United States talking about alternative facts, that you can create your own story, that it's slightly different. Robert, you should speak too, but I think it's different than when people just didn't believe it until they saw in their living room with walls of concrete dogs attacking people, or water hoses rolling kids down the street, that people would do that kind of crazy thing, or bomb a school bus, or bomb a bus of freedom riders, as opposed to so many people were killed. I mean, they were advertising killing. Remember Martin Witherspoon Gary, who, with the end of Reconstruction, I assume Robert's doing that next week, probably, he says, kill people, kill them. Don't frighten them, because that's the worst thing you can do. They'll might fight back. So kill people. That was part of the strategy for the overthrow. Well, that's one thing I want to speak to too, Robert. Now,
Go ahead, please.
When you said that people, Hamburg and Ellerton, this Reconstruction is a coup d'etat in a democracy. You have a terrorist organization, in this case, the Red Shirts primarily, who overthrow a legitimately interracial elected government. And, democracy works, or it used to until this last election almost. It used to literally be that if you did not like what a group were doing, then you voted for somebody else and voted them out. And I often say to people who said that, Reconstruction was such a failure, if it was such a failure, then why did you have to have a terrorist group have a coup d'etat instead of just vote people out? And that's what happened. Terror, and we have just sort of treated this as, oh, it was nothing. And as Robert made the point, there were very few federal troops anywhere in the South. They were not withdrawn, incidentally. Everybody thinks in 1877 they left. They didn't. They just were not stopping whites from doing it. And I want to say one of the reasons in Colfax massacre, where all these African Americans were murdered, and Arm and I can talk about this later when we're talking about our book. The Supreme Court decided, even though they were convicted at the local level, the Supreme Court said no, because there was no state action. These people who killed them were not police officers or militia. They were just red shirts in Louisiana like they were here. And after that, and these lawyers are connected. You can see how they're connected. It's a few days after it comes down to this Hamburg massacre happens. Then the Ellerton massacre. The Supreme Court gave the right for white people, as long as they were not somehow part of the state officially, to kill them, because then you had only white jurors to convict, and no white jurors were convicted. So that's just something to throw out there. But I want to point that in to reinforce what Robert was saying about how that they were allowed to get away with this sort of thing. And incidentally, Grant is a great example, but so many more whites supported Reconstruction than anybody. I did a local study, and I guarantee you go into any local community and you'll find former Confederates who were working with Black people. I've argued on the local level that Reconstruction was working great, in fact, and that's why they had to overthrow it. because with the vote, people get political rights. With those political rights, you had both Gary and Martin Witherspoon Butler. No, wait a minute, I got Butler and Gary, the two who lead the Red Church. Both of them were trying to get Black politicians to help them get railroads and things like that. And they're working, you have Black and white partnership. It begets economic development for the Black community and whites working together. And that, I think, became, in fact, something that begets social change. My example of that in Edgefield was where a judge, a Black judge Baptist on the Baptist church, marries his former enslaved person. And I thought that is a great symbol of the kind of changes that were happening during Reconstruction that we just written out. Oh, I know, I used, Sims was my textbook in 96. It was used till 1980 in South Carolina. And one of the assignments was for students to go out, and this is for Black students as well now, and tell your father rode with the Red Shirts, and you're supposed to write an essay about how great it was that they saved South Carolina from the tragedy of Reconstruction, the most progressive era in the history of South Carolina, and the most misunderstood period as well. Okay, now you can back to
Any other questions?
I want to say that Dr. Burton was in Los Angeles until a little while ago, and I didn't think he was going to be vital for this evening, but he's shown his youthful resilience. And he and Armin Durfner, that he mentioned, will be our guests again for Class 7 on April 17th. Vernon mentioned his new book, Justice Denied, or Deferred, excuse me, Justice Deferred. And the reason he and Armin were in San Francisco this past weekend was they were the guest speakers at the National Bar Association's annual meeting about this book. And so do stay tuned for that. Thank you, Armin. Thank you, Vernon.
Thank you. Thank you for the plug. Never write a book that comes out during COVID. Where'd it go?
I feel your pain all too well, trust me. Any other questions about Reconstruction? I will say that we will pick up with the end of Reconstruction and the post-Reconstruction period next Monday. Any questions at all about Reconstruction tonight? Any questions?
I'm sorry, we just scratched the surface of what I think is the most important period. People look to the Civil War, and everybody loves the Civil War in the sense that this is where the identity of America is, if you're going to look for it. And maybe so, more people died. And also, I guess the issues really become, after Lincoln decides it's not just about the Union, but the ending of enslavement, and then moving toward the citizenship, because it deals with the question we still deal with today. What happens to people you perceive as different from you when you form a country, or sort of multiculturalism. But I really think that it is Reconstruction that is important, because that's where we did what we were supposed to do, or what we became. We did it through the reconstructing of the Union there. And those 13th and 14th and 15th Amendments, I cannot emphasize enough how important they are. They changed the Constitution, and I can talk about that next time. I know it's getting late, but no matter what the judges say, if they read laws like the First and Second Amendment as broadly as they can, then they have to be consistent, or they are absolutely, it seems to me, hypocritical. They need to read that 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment just as broadly. And they have changed the Constitution and changed America in a powerful way. And to let them get away with getting away with not recognizing those three amendments, we just cannot let that happen.
We're on it.
Randall, I see your hand is raised.
the readings over the last 2 weeks, and I'm still reading about the diary of the white Union officer with the colored troops, and the readings about Reconstruction are, and I say this after every session, they're blowing my mind. But as good as this interaction is over Zoom, the readings have been so carefully curated that I spend hours on them, and I go back to them because this is stuff I never knew before. So my mind remains blown, and I don't care what you say.
Thank you, Randall.
I think part of the reason that you're seeing state legislators start to say that you cannot teach certain things in schools is because of how successful school teachers have been, public school teachers, I guess all school teachers, who I really believe do God's work, that I knew right after the Army 1970 at Princeton, we knew that Reconstruction was this exciting and had done these things, but it takes we knew the Civil War was about enslaving people, but it takes a long time for that to get down from where historians are doing primary research, making these arguments, to them teaching for years till it gets down to being taught in 8th grade and high school history classes. And I think that the teachers have done a magnificent job. And my hope for the future is because I just don't believe young people want to be prejudiced. I think they want everybody to have equal rights under the law. And I think that's our hope. And I think one of the reasons we're seeing all these crazy laws coming about is because of the success of people learning about their history and trying to say, we're not going to be like that. We see what other people did, and we don't want to do that. And so now they're trying to stop teaching about things like Reconstruction. I think they undid themselves, however, when they said you're supposed to know the Constitution. I love that. I read the 13th, 14th Amendment to everybody over and over again.
Thank you, Dr. Burton. There is a question in the chat. I think this is for Dr. Burton, from Cecil Rigby. Do you approve of the idea to add Supreme Court members?
I don't know. Arm and I wrote a Washington Post article. My real hope is evidence. Despite this crazy time of postmodern history and alternative facts, there is evidence. I have a little quote. I'll bring it the next time I hear from John Adams, who I love on this thing. Our second president, and only he and his son of all the first presidents till Lincoln were the only anti-slavery presidents, really. Till Lincoln was John and John Quincy Adams. But I have seen, and Seth can, I think, reinforce this. The first case I ever testified in, this judge was supposed to be, I was told by Laughlin McDonald, don't even worry about it, just get the evidence in, because this judge is on the right side of Genghis Khan, and there'll be no way that we can win. In the case, he wrote the best, or his law clerks wrote the best decision once he saw the evidence. I hope that if someone's going to be a judge, even in a partisan era, I have seen judges who I've seen judges who say, that they don't like what they're deciding, but the evidence is there. And remember the great dissenter, the first Justice Harlan, he says in the Plessy dissent, he believes the white race is superior. However, the equal justice under the law is what the Constitution says. So I have hope that if we can present, we cannot turn away from the evidence. I mean, I think that we do have the higher law argument, but that's not going to win. We're just going to yell at folks, but at each other. But if we could, like when when I got through debating the Federalist Society, I won't brag, let's just let it go, but I was the only one in the room saying, we have evidence. Evidence is on our side. Like Reconstruction that Robert's teaching about is there. That history shows us the possibilities. It also shows us that people don't want that to happen, and they'll do things that have to be stopped because you've got to follow, it seems to me, equal justice under the law, just like it says over the Supreme Court. So I don't know. That's one way. It was never set at 9, started with 3, went to 6, 5. It's been all over the place. The problem is you do that, then the next political party gets elected, does it again. So it, you know, I'm just not sure about changing. It never has been set at 9. There's no rule it has to be. And it was set up, the courts, and we talk about the courts were set up when it was a very much smaller country. It was, you know, where in those days, each judge would sort of be riding a circuit at the lower courts, even though he was a Supreme Court justice. So it made some sense, but look at how big this country is now and how many people. And you go either way, but my hope is through evidence. If you have some other ideas, I'd appreciate it, but I just feel like it will come back to bite. And, you know, if we do expand. Now, when Roosevelt threatened it, there was that stitch in time, save 9, you know, change. So a lot of that's politics, but it's a dangerous politics, I think, particularly the way people have played with the Constitution lately.
And I think to that point, I just want to show one last thing before we finish up this evening. The use of history in the Supreme Court is something that Orville Burton and Armin Durkler will talk about in a couple of weeks on April 17th, class number 7, about their book, Justice Deferred. But to talk about how this history means something even in the here and now, I recall there was a story from last year about Ketanji Brown Jackson, the new Supreme Court justice, the first Black woman to serve on the court. And she has actually used this idea of originalism that conservatives often like to trumpet, this idea of we're going to interpret the Constitution based on how it was originally written. And Ketanji Brown Jackson's response was, well, if we take an original interpretation of the 14th Amendment,
Yes.
what does that mean? And so what she said was, it says here, this is a quote from her, I don't think we can assume that just because race is taken into account, that necessarily creates an equal protection problem. Because I understood that we looked at the history and traditions of the Constitution and what the framers and founders thought about. When I drilled down to that level of analysis, it became clear to me that the framers themselves adopted the Equal Protection Clause, the 14th Amendment, the 15th Amendment in a race-conscious way. She said, I looked at the report that was submitted by the Joint Committee on Reconstruction, which drafted the 14th Amendment, and that report says the entire point of the amendment was to secure rights of the freed former slaves. So again, if you're thinking about interpretations of the Constitution and originalism, and in particular, if you're thinking about the Reconstruction era amendments of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the Constitution, then it becomes pretty apparent what those amendments were about and who they were meant to actually help and to help make proper citizens of the United States. All right. Any final questions at all?
And the 13th Amendment has that same clause. People forget it. I think the 13th Amendment can still be used to end the badges of slavery, as they were called by the courts at those times. And it has the same clause that gives Congress the right to do that. It gets back to voting. It really gets back to the right to vote, and for people have to vote.
Exactly. Any closing questions or comments for even myself or Dr. Burton? As Randall puts it, I know that all of our minds are blown. But again, I want I want to give a sense of where we're going with the class. Of course, tonight we've covered a good chunk of Reconstruction. Next Monday, on April 10th, we're going to cover the end of Reconstruction and the beginning of the post-Reconstruction era, and look at how the state is fundamentally altered by, as Dr. Burton refers to, the coup d'etat that happens in the state that ends Reconstruction. That'll be next Monday. And then the Sunday after that, April 16th, we'll be inviting Dr. Jennifer Taylor to talk a bit about, as she terms it, from red shirts to Proud Boys, museum artifacts, white domestic terror, and election fraud. That'll be a bit about how the debates over monuments and memorials and public history all tie into these broader themes we've been talking about this semester in terms of white terrorism and the like. And then, of course, Class 7 on April 17th is Vernon Burton will return along with Armin Durfner to talk about their book, Justice Deferred, Race, and the Supreme Court. So we've got some exciting classes coming up in the next few weeks. Yes.
Dr. Greene, we don't have any music queued up, but what we want to do is play what we call ambient house music so that people in Zoom land can wish they were here and see us milling around, greeting and touching each other and having a beverage. And so we're going to let you watch until you get bored and leave. We really do appreciate you coming. Thank you so much.
Good job, Robert. Really good job. Thank you. Terrific.
Thank you, guys. Really, this was my favorite class so far this semester. So thank you. It was good to see you, Seth. Miss you in the State House.
Yeah, and a worn out Burton is better than most historians.
Thank you. Good to see you, Becky. Thank you for speaking.
This is great. I
Enjoyed everything.
won't miss it.
Always good to see you,
I
bro.
won't miss it.
Everybody. Good to see you. All right.
I'm milling around.
Hey, yeah, let's have a toast anyway. All right, I'll see you all next time. Everybody be careful. All right, Becky.
Thanks, Mr.
Bye.
Whipper. That was really awesome. I totally
Take
agree
care,
with
Mr.
you.
Whipper.
Put that on a
Thank
separate
y'all.
video for all of us to be able to watch over and over again.
That's it. That's it. Thank you so much. See you next time. Quiet.